What are you going to do with the time that's been given to you? This is the story of Esther. And Esther is the second of the narratives that we have in our Advent series called Into This World, where we are spending time looking at the world in which Jesus enters. Last week we dealt with Habakkuk and all the wars. And we thought, how is this the world that Jesus is entering? Today, we look at the story of Esther. And in doing these examinations of these narratives, we're realizing that our lives and our world have many similarities to the world of the Hebrew Scriptures, the world in which Jesus entered, and the world that Jesus continues to enter. Now, Esther is the 17th book of the Hebrew Scriptures, which we call the Old Testament. How many of you know the story of Esther? A few. Well, hopefully after today, you'll know a lot more. It was written in what they believe to be the 5th century BCE, at a time when Persia has overthrown the Babylonians, and the Jews are now freed to return to Jerusalem after their exile through the Babylonian captivity. This is all done under the King Xerxes, but the story of Esther has the king's name as a different name than King Xerxes, and that's why it leads people to believe that perhaps this story and many other stories like it are seen more for their depth and their meaning and their purpose of telling a story rather than being an historical account of the Jewish people. Now, a lot of times these stories are made in order to tell how the Jewish people have been threatened throughout the ages of being killed as a whole entire race of people. And Esther is one of those stories. As Eric on Wednesday said, the rabbi is fond of saying, we have lots of these stories. People threaten to kill us. They don't. We eat. These stories are the basis for many festivals in the Jewish tradition. And Esther is the basis of the festival of Purim. This is celebrated every year, usually in late winter, early spring. It's in the 14th month of the Jewish calendar, called Adar. And this is a celebration that commemorates the fact that Persia, in ancient Persia, there was a threat of genocide for the Jews, and yet they were saved. And so they celebrate that every year in the celebration of Purim. And these cookies that you see here are called Hamantashen. And I have the recipe for them, and we're going to put it up on Facebook and online, so if you want to make them. Plus, we're going to have them for Darkwood Brew this next week as well. So they're wonderful little cookies with fillings inside. And our Sunday school class, a couple weeks ago, studied this book of Esther and the story about Esther, and they made them. How many of the kids here today were a part of that lesson in Sunday school? Raise your hands. Really tall. Hi. Yay? How many of you actually remember the story? Okay, well, there were a bunch of different characters. One character's name was Haman. You remember Haman? What did you do when you heard the name Haman? Thumbs down, right? He's kind of the villain in the story, right? And what about the name Mordecai? What did you do when you had Mordecai? Yeah, this, right? You did that kind of lookout sign. Because Mordecai was the kind of the good guy in the story, right? Who's always looking out for his people. And so whenever you hear the name Mordecai, you can go ahead and do this as I'm telling the story. And then I expect a whole bunch of cookies by the end of the week. Now, it's really great to have our Sunday school following along with us in this narrative lectionary, and I hope that you will engage the children in talking about this story, because we are telling the same story in both places, and so it's great for families to be able to go home and talk about these stories with one another and share their perspectives. And they probably know more about this story than I do, so if I get it wrong, go ask them to help us get it right. To set up the story and this text you're about to hear from the book of Esther, you're only going to get a small portion of the text from the 4th chapter of Esther as our scripture for today, so I want to set it up for you. What's happening in the book of Esther, as it begins, is there's a king and a queen that are ruling Persia. And this king is in the middle of a 5-month banquet celebration. 5 months of celebrating with his governors, his military leaders, and all the, high muckety-muck people throughout the entire region of Persia. Now, after 5 months, this can get to be quite a heady celebration, right? And the king starts to get really sentimental, and one of the things that he asks in the midst of this celebration is for the queen to parade around in her crown and show everybody how beautiful she is. Reasonable request, don't you think, after 5 months? The queen refuses. The king gets really angry. And his advisors tell him, not only is this disrespectful of the king, but it's also a total disrespect for all the men throughout all of Persia, throughout the region. And she should be held up as a sign for all other women throughout the region that they cannot disrespect their husbands and not do as they have been requested by their husbands. That was the advice. What do you think happened? He followed the advice. He deposed the queen. The queen was punished for refusing her husband. And then a decree went out to the entire region of Persia, telling everyone that a man is a master in his own home. We need decrees for that. So Vashti, who was the queen that was deposed, was somebody who risked a lot to say no to her husband and was punished for it. This is kind of the atmosphere in which Esther enters the story. Because there is no queen now, because Queen Vashti has been deposed, they are in search, the king's court are in search of a new queen for the king. So essentially what they have is a beauty contest, right? They go out and they gather in a whole bunch of young unmarried women. They go through the lot of them and determine the best of the best. Then they give them a year's worth of beauty treatments. Awesome, right? And then they parade them in front of the king, and the king gets to decide who's best suited to be the next queen of Persia. Now, Esther was being raised by her cousin Mordecai. There we go. Mordecai is an older cousin. Esther's parents were killed, and so Mordecai took her in and was raising her. And when he heard about this beauty contest, he thought this was a good idea for Esther to advance her career. So he enters Esther into this contest. And she, being grateful that he's raising her, goes along with it, right? And believe it or not, she actually gets to be one of the ones chosen. And within the year, she is chosen as the queen, the one who finds the most favor with the king. And she becomes the queen of Persia. So Esther is now living in the king's court, and Mordecai is left outside by the king's gate, as it should be. But he's still Mordecai. So he's still looking out for all of his people and the people that he cares for, including Esther. So he sits by the gate of the palace and hoping to hear word about how Esther's doing. And she hopes to find out from him how her family is doing, because they're a little bit isolated. She's kept kind of away from where she grew up. So as he's sitting there waiting for word from Esther, he uncovers a plot of an assassination against the king. And he makes sure to get word to Esther that this is happening so that she can inform her husband and stop the assassination. When the king finds out about it, he is so happy and overjoyed, he instantly starts looking for a way to reward Mordecai. Then comes Haman, right? Ooh. Haman comes into the story as one of the king's most trusted advisors and is raised up and given much power in the kingdom. As Haman is walking down the street, because everyone recognizes him as the right-hand man of the king, everyone bows down before him. Everyone except Mordecai. right? Mordecai is a Jew. Jews are forbidden to bow down to anyone but Yahweh. Haman is angry that every time he walks out into the kingdom, none of the Jews are bowing down to him. He's furious, and Mordecai is the example of Jews everywhere. So while the king is looking for ways to reward Mordecai for his loyalty in to uncover the assassination plot, Haman, his second-hand man, is planning a way to kill Mordecai. So they're at odds with one another immediately in the story. So the plot thickens, right? And Esther is right there in the middle of the two. So Haman goes into the king and tells the story about the Jewish people and how they disrespect Persia and all of their customs and all of their rules, and they refuse to obey, and that this ought not to be tolerated in this kingdom. He's so convincing, in fact, that the king, who is listening to him and does not know, by the way, at this point, that Esther is herself a Jew, allows Haman to raise money, raise soldiers, and send a decree out to all of Persia saying that these Jews are a menace and they ought to be obliterated, and they are willing to pay people to help them achieve that. A genocide of the Jewish people. Now, apparently, genocides take time. And with this decree, everyone's aware that they're planning to kill all the Jews in the region. Even the Jews know this. So let's listen to the story of Esther from our scripture today to see Mordecai's response.
When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was deeply distressed, she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king and make supplication to him and entreat him for the people. Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him the message for Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come to the king in 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything that Esther ordered him to do.
So Esther is in the middle of this fight between Haman and Mordecai. And the king is also in the middle. Doesn't even know a lot of the things that are, affiliated with the story, only know what he's being told. But Mordecai is devastated by this news of the pending genocide of the Jews, obviously. And he tears his robes and sits at the entrance to the palace in sackcloth and ashes, hoping and praying for salvation from the Lord. He's convinced that in the history of the Jews, they have always been saved or liberated from terrible situations. And he's sure that in prayer, Yahweh will defend them, will save them. So he's looking for a way to participate with Yahweh in this salvation. And he knows his best bet is his cousin Esther. Esther, who seems to be in the exact right place at the exact right time that he needs her. So he goes to Esther and he asks her to help. Now Esther is known for her beauty. She's not necessarily known for her courage. She's always been someone who has gone along with what she was expected to do. She was an orphan. And so she was grateful for all the support that she could get. And she always tried to please the people who were giving her that support. Even in her role as the queen, she did the king's bidding. She did what he pleased, what pleased him. So this is something that now she's being requested to do by a cousin whom she loves, like a father, to try to save her people. But what he's asking her to do is risk everything, not only her position, but her very life. Because to go before the king without an invitation means to risk her life. To go before the king and admit that she's now a Jew when she hasn't told him that before, because Mordecai explicitly told her not to when she first entered the contest, that too now sets her up for death. She sees herself as an orphan still, as someone without any power. And in the midst of her powerlessness, she is being asked to reach down and find an identity that she is not sure she possesses. Couldn't anyone else do this? She has to decide for herself whether this is her time and her place. And she has to do it risking herself, the lives of her people, and her own life as well. Mordecai's not asking her to do an easy thing. Now, when we look at this story of Esther with our own contemporary eyes, we see a completely different world from our own, right? I mean, we don't parade around women in crowns, right? We don't live in a world where the very wealthy and the very poor are so separated, and the gap keeps getting wider and wider, and the opportunities keep getting smaller and smaller for interaction. We don't do that. We don't keep kings and queens away from their people, right? And we certainly don't live in a world where somebody might plan to kill someone just because they didn't bow down to them. That would never happen in a political situation, would it? And how many of you have ever been to a 5-month-long banquet? Esther's world is completely different than ours. But in so many ways, it's exactly the same. The disconnect of the people with the leaders, the disconnect from our own selves to our identities and what we're being called to do and how we can participate with the whole of the world is the same. And this is exactly the challenge that Mordecai brings to Esther. Mordecai says to her, if you keep silent At such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. Mordecai is telling her that God is involved in this, and God's activity is happening with or without her. Her choice in this matter is not the time she lives. Her choice is whether or not she chooses to participate in the time that she lives. It will be done. The Jews will be delivered. By the way, I'm not going to tell you the end of the story. You have to go read it. They win. The question is whether Esther is the one that's going to help them do that. And she has to look inside herself and listen for God's voice to see if she is the one being called in this time and in this place. At the very opening of the sermon, we had the video clip from the Fellowship of the Rings, which is a part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And we had Frodo trying to decide for himself if this is his time. And he says to Gandalf, I wish this did not happen in my own time. And Gandalf answers him, so do all people who find themselves in such situations. They all wish that it would happen in somebody else's time. But it is not for us, he says, to choose the time in which we live. Our choice is to choose what to do with the time that we've been given. That's the wisdom of Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings. And that's exactly what Mordecai is challenging Esther to do. What are you going to do with the time that you've been given? God's out there working. Will you choose to participate in what God is already doing? Last Wednesday, we had the Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers as our guest on Darkwood Brew. She spoke to us live from her apartment in Staten Island, and it happened to be on the exact night that the ruling came down not to indict the police officer who was accused of holding Eric Garner in a chokehold that led to his death. This coming in the wake of the Ferguson non-indictment as well. So there were all kinds of protests going on outside of her door while she was talking to us. And she challenged us in that time and in that place as she spoke the story of Esther to us. If maybe these are signs that we are seeing now, that we are being called to act in our time and in our place. She said, who knows? Maybe we are here in this time and in this moment for a reason. And maybe we are called to do something different in order to bring peace, in order to lift up the lives of our brothers and our sisters regardless of their race. Perhaps we are here for such a time as this, to call out this kind of injustice, and maybe even be ready to pay a price, the way Esther was ready to pay a price. Is this our world? Is this our time? Are we being called to respond to this place right here, right now? And how are we being called? How will we recognize the signs? Each of us called into our own times for our own purposes. What does that look like? How do we recognize these signs? Will we be able to rise to the occasion even if we start to recognize that we can maybe help? How do we live into our own identity in the midst of the struggles and the injustice of this world? Jesus is our clue. This is Advent. This is the world in which Jesus entered in Esther's time and in our time and in every time. The love of God that enters into our lives and allows us to reach out and be a part of the world, to engage with the other in a way that gives them value and meaning, to engage in a way that brings us into our identities and gives us life. This love that Jesus brings this Advent and every Advent, it transforms us and brings us into the people God created us to be, where we can rise to the occasion, much like Esther did in her story, to be the change we wish to see in the world. There are many, many leaders that have come up through the ages since Esther's time that have shown us an alternative way to live, alternative ways to act for justice in the world, to be an agent of liberation for others in the world. And as great as all these leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mother Teresa and Gandhi and Mandela, as great as they are, the love of Jesus calls us to become agents in and of ourselves, to act for justice in the world. And with a bunch of individuals acting in Jesus' love, the whole world is transformed in our time and in our place with our people that we have been given to love. This is the challenge of the book of Esther in our time. Even as we parade women with crowns, even as we have struggles in the streets, even as we have injustices coming down night and day, we are in this together, and God's love binds us together in a way that is inescapable. And we feed off of each other in order to find new solutions. That happens through love. It happens through life. And Jesus shows us how. Through this meal, Jesus